Okay, in chapter 4, we're going to be discussing consciousness. Now, what is consciousness? So that is defined as being state of being where you're aware of oneself, your thoughts, or your environment. And consciousness actually has various levels throughout the 24-hour cycle of life, and we will talk about those a little more in depth as we go. One thing that a lot of people are surprised to learn, though, that we're actually still aware and conscious while we're asleep. And we'll look at that a little more in detail further on in this discussion. And finally, we will discuss how drugs actually can create changes in our consciousness and kind of help but they help ease pain and anxiety. So we'll take a look at those in just a little bit. So as far as the evolution, how psychologists started talking and studying consciousness, you'll remember from earlier chapters when we started learning about the history of psychology that Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener were two of the important founders of psychology. So Wilhelm Wundt was very big about studying consciousness. As a matter of fact, he said psychology, the purpose of psychology should be to study consciousness. And later on, the American psychologist, William James, he actually was responsible for that phrase that you may have even heard called a stream of consciousness. And so he said that consciousness is never just broken up into little segments, that it actually we are conscious in a continuous stream, and it kind of ebbs and flows throughout the 24-hour cycle, but it actually never really stops. It's a constant stream. And then Watson and Skinner, as you will remember, they were behaviorists, and that it was their philosophy that psychology should only really study behavior because that's really the only thing we can directly observe, and whereas we cannot directly observe mental processes. Now, keep in mind, that these were, early philosophies and contributors to or contributions to the development of psychology, and current psychology might have different ideas and opinions than these. Okay, so studying consciousness, so cognitive psychology, what that is concerned with is it's mental processes, and both conscious and unconscious. It's things like thinking, problem solving, language. And then the term optogenetics, that's actually refers to technology, and that looks at neurons that, actually might be responsible. They switch on and off, and they actually can trigger different states of consciousness. And so we'll move on from there. So the nature of consciousness, they talk about you'll hear the term automatic processing. And so what they mean by that is our sensory system, all of our sensory neurons, that are throughout our entire body. You remember, they actually are constantly being, just throughout the day. They are constantly receiving just massive quantities of information. And but we cannot, be fully 100% conscious and pay attention to all of that. But definitely sensory information, like light, sound, temperature, pressure, pain, things like that. Those are all, we're constantly feeling and taking in information regarding those through our sensory nervous neurons. And so just keep that in mind as we progress through this, okay? And then what they mention down here at the bottom, they say information is detected, it's encoded, and sometimes stored without awareness. So that is really important, and that we'll look at really in depth in that in the following chapter. That is in regard to sensation and perception. But detection, that is sensation. That is when our sensory neurons are detecting information. And then our sensory neurons send that up to our brain, up through the spinal cord and right up to our brain. And then it's encoded and then stored in the brain into our memory banks. So in a nutshell, that's what that final sentence is in regard to. Now, selective attention, that is the ability to focus our awareness on just a little bit of incoming information at a time. And usually that, our selective attention, that is guided by what is most important to us at the time. Either, something that we're striving for, something we place a lot of value on, or even something like survival, like we may suddenly sense that something violent might be about to occur and that for survival purposes we need to react. So that is selective attention. Now remember, consciousness, that occurs at many different levels. It can be like I said, it ebbs and flows. It can be very strong, and you would be very fully alert and awake at certain times of the day. And then I think if you ever notice that at other times of the day, you might feel, like you're not quite as alert. You might be a little drowsy, that you need, take a siesta or take a nap or just get some rest, some downtime. And so our consciousness, it rises, it ebbs, and then it flows. And yeah, so that is something important to remember and keep in mind when you're thinking about consciousness. Okay, so now we're going to just talk about sleep here. And as I mentioned earlier, that we remain conscious while we're asleep. And that's why the topic of sleep is actually included in this discussion. And so, they mention a couple things here, that definitely humans, our sleep needs vary. Some people, they only require a few hours sleep at night, and others require 10 or more hours sleep per night, for to function the best. And let's move on here. So what's important to keep in mind here, there's this term called circadian rhythms. And throughout the 24-hour cycle, remember half of that it will be generally in daytime, and then the other half will be generally at nighttime. But that flow throughout the 24-hour cycle, that's actually called the circadian rhythm. Now they mention some things here, the desire for sleep is greatest early, early morning between 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. and in the mid-afternoon around 2:30 p.m. So this isn't true for all people. This is just a broad generalization. Now, how the mechanisms, the neuropsychological mechanisms that occur to actually make us sleep or wake up, that is actually determined by a part of the brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And as they mention here, that is like our master inner clock, and it's within the hypothalamus. And it communicates with areas of the brain, other hypothalamus areas, and the reticular formation. And that's what causes us to be either alert or to get sleepy. And I included some notes down here below. I'm not going to elaborate upon them, but feel free to pause the video here and read those notes and to gain a little more insight into what actually occurs with our suprachiasmatic nucleus. Now, definitely, as we talk about sleep, sleep occurs in various stages. So what's important to have as a foundation is some certain terms. And so our brains actually have what's called waves. And those can be really high in frequency or lower in frequency. They're varying frequency waves. And so beta waves, that is when we are at our most alert and awake state. And then alpha waves, that's when that actually is when we are in our most relaxed, drowsy state. And alpha waves, those occur um, right when one is basically about when you're really relaxing and about to go to sleep. It doesn't mean when you're fully asleep yet, but that's that state where you might start just lightly thinking about things that occurred throughout the day or things that are on your mind, but you feel yourself, going into a state of sleep. And then non-rapid eye movement, we call that non-REM sleep or NREM sleep. And that is the very early stages when you're asleep. And usually that occurs in three different stages. And so that is when you're not quite fully into a dream state. But then when you do get into your dream state, um, then that's called REM sleep, REM, REM sleep. And that is when you've gone through your three phases of non-REM sleep. And then you go into REM sleep. And then that is when the brain becomes very active. And that's when one starts dreaming and everything. Now, the other two types of waves they mention here are theta waves, and those occur during the early stages of sleep, and then delta waves, and that is you're in your slow wave sleep. So definitely during a typical night's sleep here, we usually have 4 or 5 stages of sleep cycles, and those each stage lasts, approximately about 90 minutes. And so a lot of people are, kind of surprised to learn that we actually have, 4 to 5 stages of sleep throughout the night. They think we fall asleep and then you just dream all night long, and that's actually not the case. Okay, so just as a reminder here, non-REM sleep, that's usually your first 3 stages of sleep, and that's when you're not dreaming. They call it the non-dreaming sleep state. Now, REM sleep, they actually call it REM because that stands for rapid eye movement. And that's usually when we are dreaming and the brain becomes very fast and active and has very short, fast brain waves. And we dream very vividly, and usually our bodies and especially our eyes, they'll actually twitch and everything. And yeah, so I don't know if you've ever noticed someone else sleeping and you see their eyes twitching and things. They're in a state of REM sleep. Now the thing is there obviously for certain people, unfortunately, who have sleep disturbances, they can be in different forms, and one of these is called narcolepsy, and that's when one can actually just fall asleep, right in the middle of the day and right in the middle of doing something they're doing. Take for instance, sitting in class or listening, sitting at work or something, and then you'll just fall into actual sleep. So that's called narcolepsy. Whereas cataplexy, that refers to total loss of muscle strength that occurs when someone is awake. And that can be, very disturbing for people who deal with that. Okay, and then sleep paralysis, that usually happens to all of us. And that actually happens right before falling asleep, or sometimes when people are just waking up, they'll not be able to move at first, can't get out of bed at first, and they're still in sleep paralysis. Now, if you remember during REM sleep, our minds are very active and our bodies are twitching, and everything. And so that's why our body actually goes into sleep paralysis, so we don't thrash about and twitch really drastically, and we can be in a more peaceful state while we experience that. Okay, so I'm going to go past this right here, and feel free to pause this video at any time and look at this for further insight. Now, insomnia, I think a lot of us are familiar with what insomnia is. That occurs with, a lot of people. It's the most common disorder, and it's the inability to fall asleep or stay asleep. So some people may fall asleep very quickly because they're very tired, but 1 hour or 2 hours later, they'll wake up and then can't get back to sleep for the rest of the night. Uh, Often that's triggered by stress, anxiety, sometimes excessive travel like jet lag, aging, and definitely drug or alcohol use. Now, other sleep disturbances, you all have heard of sleepwalking, and that usually occurs during stages 3 and 4 and of non-REM sleep. And because if you think about that, we can't get up and sleepwalk while we're involved in rapid eye movement sleep, because our brains are too active, and we're actually in a state of sleep paralysis, at that stage. Okay, a couple of other sleep disturbances. They talk about sleep terrors and nightmares. And so I just want to bring your attention down to the bottom there. And I just added a note there about what recent research talks about nightmares and everything. So please, take a moment and look at that. Moving on. Sleep deprivation, that will definitely affect one's mental and physical health. Inability to keep your focus of attention, and might result in microsleep episodes. So that just means, very, nodding off very quickly, right in the middle of doing things, or in the middle of a discussion or a class or something like that. And remember, chronic sleep deprivation, that can lead to other issues, like heart disease, diabetes, weight gain, and really adversely affect one's immune system. Okay, so just, wrapping up sleep here, why do we sleep? And so they say, the purpose of sleep has not been conclusively identified, although current research does know a lot about why we sleep. And one is the restorative theory. And I put in a note there that occurs when our glial cells in our brain, they actually clean metabolic waste that occurs from the brain activity that we go through as we're awake through the whole day. So as we're thinking all day and using our brains all day, it's creating metabolic waste. And when we go to sleep at night, those glial cells actually clean that metabolic waste out. And that's very important for our health, mentally and physically. Evolutionary theory, that just refers to, it just says, look, we sleep because that's an evolutionary thing that has occurred, for survival purposes. And then finally, consolidation of memories and learning. And that just refers to the neuroscientific understanding that while we're sleeping, our brain is striving to make neurological connections in the brain. And it's actually putting together things that happened throughout our day into our memories, and then storing it and hooking it together with other types of information that are related to that. So basically making sense out of what occurred in one's day. Okay, so now we're going to talk about dreaming briefly. And so you can't talk about dreams these days, without referring back to Sigmund Freud. Back in the early 1900s and everything, he was very a major proponent of the idea that dreams have meanings. And he said we dream because we're trying to fulfill wishes or we have unconscious desires and everything. And then he says that, but, you keep in mind, though, that now psychologists and researchers, they say that, dreams pretty much do not really have the kind of hidden meanings that one might suggest. And so that refers right up here where it says the activation synthesis model. And that refers to there's no meaning in dreams, that it's basically dreams are what they call neural chatter. That's just the result of all of the neurophysiological things that are happening in our brains while we're asleep. So that's just something to keep in mind. I'm not trying to influence anybody in any way whatsoever in regard to that. Okay, so dream content, that's usually has to do, we usually tend to dream about the things that we are, that's most important to us, the things that we're, life issues we're dealing with, or take, for instance, you have been studying very intensely for an important exam or something, or you have an important family matter, something like that, and one will tend to dream about things like that. But dreams, they tend to, we tend to dream on average about 1 to 2 hours per night. And a lot of people are surprised because they think, well, I thought I dream all night long. And generally that's not true. And lucid dreams down at the bottom there, that's just lucid dreaming just means when one is kind of aware that you're dreaming. So that's kind of an interesting, multi-dimensional type way of dreaming. And right here, on the right here, you'll see 2 brain scans, and you'll see that right up above the one on the top there, if you look at the activity, look at all the spots, the red spots that are happening during rapid eye movement or REM sleep. Look how active the brain is right there. You'll see that it's a lot of the regions of the brain are engaged and firing. So it's a very active time. So one can even say our brains are more active while we're in REM sleep than when we're fully awake. And then if you look down below and you see the same brain, but while it's awake, you'll see the much greater reduced activity in those same regions. So that's very interesting. Okay, so finally, I'm not going to dwell and elaborate upon all of these in extreme detail, but drugs definitely alter our states of consciousness. And drugs come in many forms, so basically they say, psychoactive drugs, those are chemicals that cause changes in our psychological activities. And that can even include caffeine, nicotine, and prescription medications. And so caffeine is actually considered the most widely used psychoactive drug in the world. Now, there's other types of drugs that are called depressants, and those decrease activity in our central nervous system. They call that neural activity and reduce anxiety. And so there's also opioids and opiates. And just would like for you to look at those on your own. Now, drinking alcohol, that is associated with reduced mental and physical health, if, binge drinking, that is. And so that's just something that, certain people, college age or whatever, and, they may be familiar with. So it's just something to consider here. Now, other drugs like cocaine, amphetamines, what those do is they produce, like a rush of pleasure. And that we experience that pleasure because of the increased dopamine that reaches our dopamine receptors. And so that actually causes a rush of pleasure and excitement. Now, the thing is, all of that can actually cause, damage to our brain, especially our neural receptors. They can actually get worn out and damaged. And that's why people who are addicted to them require more and more to get the same feeling. Now, we talked about caffeine, and tobacco. And so if you'd like to look into this a little deeper, feel free to stop the video and check this out here. And same with this, hallucinogens, LSD, okay, and marijuana. They say that's the most commonly used drug in the world. They say used illicit drug, illegal drug in the world. And finally, how about social media? How does that affect, one's consciousness? And so they say, some people are starting to get kind of hooked on social media, and so much so that now that they're actually psychological therapists and everything actually provide treatment for social media addiction. So that's just something that's very interesting too. And if you want to, stop and consider like maybe what you think about that, and your personal experiences with that, if you have any. Okay, skipping this here. And we're finally going to get into hypnosis. And this is just interesting because, people consider hypnosis a change in consciousness. And so here's a bunch of false claims. And definitely people cannot be hypnotized against their will. They can't, so really what they're doing is, they're willfully engaging in hypnosis, and they're playing part in kind of like a role-playing game when they're being hypnotized. Okay, going past this. And so that ends our slide discussion. And so feel free to review and stop on any slides that you would like to take notes on. And good luck. Have fun.